What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Strong.Sistas YouTube channel, where we share about our passion for optimal human health and soil health, which are ultimately related. So we have been implementing some of Dr. Ray Peat's nutrition strategies. This is also called a pro-metabolic or bioenergetic approach. We do not implement all of these to a T, and there's a lot of dogma around this term. However, we have received a lot of criticism on the interwebs, mainly YouTube, on the social media, about this type of approach. And so in today's interview, I am very fortunate to speak with Georgi Dinkov, and we address a lot of Ray Peat criticisms. So I polled our Instagram audience for Ray Peat criticisms, and thank you all for submitting your critiques of the Ray Peat nutrition strategy. And Georgi and I did not get to all of these in today's interview. So this is a part one, and we're going to have him back on in a few weeks for a part two. So if you have any follow-up questions from anything that Georgi mentions during this interview, make sure you put them in the comments below, and I'll make sure to check that before our part two interview. But Georgi Dinkov has been doing, or has been following, a Ray Peat nutrition strategy for quite some time now. And he has a really good handle on the literature about biochemistry and metabolism. And so he puts these ideas that Ray Peat has discussed over the years into practice. And he's also actually designing some of his own studies right now, which is really cool. So make sure you guys stick around to the entire interview. Georgi brings up a lot of controversial things, especially for the low carb space. We mainly tackle the idea of like cholesterol being a problem and sugar being a problem. So those two things seem to be really demonized these days. So those are the main two topics of discussion for today's video. And like I said, we'll have him on again in a few weeks. So before getting into the interview, just want to clarify that like we bring up the word sugar, which kind of can encompass fruit, honey, and white table sugar, because they have roughly similar glucose to fructose split. And sugar seems to be really demonized kind of throughout health communities in the mainstream, and then also in alternative spaces as well. Sarah and I personally do not consume a lot of white table sugar. We prefer to get our carbohydrates from honey, maple syrup, and fruit, because those have the accompanying vitamins and minerals. However, in this video, we really address the question of whether sugar in itself is toxic. We're not here to just like promote people to down Pepsi and white table sugar. We're just trying to get to like the root cause of issues. And so we'd like to ask why and question things. And so I hope you guys are able to keep an open mind throughout this entire interview. So I hope you guys enjoy. Hi, Georgi. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think a great starting point for this discussion is, who is Georgi, and how did you stumble upon a Ray Peat pro-metabolic bioenergetic nutrition strategy?
Georgi is basically a hacker working in IT security as a day job, and now I guess I'm also a biohacker, for lack of a better word. Originally from Bulgaria, came in the United States in '97 for school. Stayed here after that, found a job, and basically have been here since '97, mostly in the Washington, D.C. area. I live in D.C. proper as of right now. And I've always been an very active athlete, starting from high school and then throughout my collegiate career, if we can call it that way. When I was in high school, I was actually a power lifter. And I kind of, in hindsight, I kind of regret not sticking with it, because it was the best I've ever felt, but I also was much younger back then. And then when I came to the United States and enrolled in the college, then because there wasn't any competitive powerlifting in the college, my options were mostly so-called endurance sports, and I joined the crew team. So it was basically switching from a mostly explosive power / strength related activity to a very long-term endurance, so-called fat burning activity. And I did that for about 4 years while I was in college, and then after that, couldn't grow anymore because I wasn't part of the collegiate program anymore. So I switched to running, and basically stuck with it. I graduated in 2003 and maintained that for about 5 or 6 years. And then I don't know, for whatever reason, I guess I noticed that I was starting to gain a little bit of weight, so I decided to change my dietary habits. And around 2008, 2009, I started reading some articles about the low carb diets. The reason I even had interested in that is that after I graduated from college, which was around 2003, my degrees were in computer science, and at the time, because of dot-com crash, nobody wanted to hire people with computer science degrees. We were the untouchables. So I found a job as a bioinformatics specialist at a biochemical research foundation, which was on campus in the university. So for about 2.5 years, 3 years, I was working there as a programmer, as one of only three IT people, and the other 40 or 50 were actually all biochemists and doctors. So naturally, if you go out to happy hours, all you hear about is, this condition, that condition, this pathway, that pathway. So if you want to be part of the crowd, you kind of have to fit in, and the only way to fit in is to try to learn the so-called the lingo. So I asked all these people. They're all renowned, very, very famous doctors and biochemical professionals, mostly working out of the National Institutes of Health, which is about 4 miles north of where I live in Bethesda, Maryland. So they said, look, you don't need to go to school. If all you're after is knowledge, then you just, most of the resources now are free. Read that book on biochemistry, read this book on physiology, and then start attending some of our lectures. And after about 2 years, I stuck with them for about 2.5 years. Things started to click. I started to understand what they're talking about. And after I, ended that internship and started a full-time job, I didn't lose the interest. I kept reading. I kept in touch with these people, kept reading more and more studies. And they kept saying, look, after you acquire the basic knowledge, from now on is either you conduct your own experiments or you continue reading about people's experiments on PubMed. And that's what I kept doing. So I had a degree in computer science, but my hobby more or less was biochemistry. And that's why around 2008, 2009, when I wanted to change my dietary habits, I basically started reading some studies on what the different diets do to the body. And at the time, the paleo/low carb diet wasn't even famous, wasn't even on the radar. There were just a few studies that came out that said, hey, if you, basically, if you lower your carbs, you're going to lose a lot of weight in the first few months, which turned out to be true. But what those studies subsequently found, because those were very early studies, found out that most of the weight loss was actually due to water loss. When you cut carbs, it has a very similar effect to taking a diuretic drug. So you're mostly losing water the first few months. So you're going to shrink a little bit. Your midsection may shrink a little bit, but you're not really losing much fat. And if you continue with that dietary pattern, as I found out the hard way, then you start getting into these pathological changes. Your cortisol rises. So I started experiencing classical symptoms of high cortisol. I was having electrolyte imbalances, insomnia, nervousness, irritation, anxiety, inability to concentrate at work, all of these things. And then, by the way, they were confirmed when I look at my old blood test that I had with my primary care practitioner. My cortisol was always maybe about 10 to 20% above my morning cortisol was above the upper limit of normal. But the doctor wasn't worried. He kept saying, oh, you're an active athlete. It's normal to have this level of cortisol. I've seen professional athletes, their cortisol is like 2 times to 3 times the higher the upper limit of normal. And he's right, but it doesn't mean that's healthy. And maybe one of the reasons why we're seeing so many former elite athletes develop these drastic health problems a few years after ending their professional career. Not many people know, but Michael Phelps is a very hardcore alcoholic who had to enter rehab multiple times because of his extremely high cortisol levels. And high cortisol is a known risk factor for alcoholism. Why? Because alcohol lowers cortisol. So it's very simple. It's just these people are self-medicating without even knowing that their problem is that through these years of overexertion, they've upregulated their baseline production of cortisol. And when they're done with the athletic activity, first of all, because the cortisol is high, they rapidly gain weight. And also the cortisol stays high because the enzymes that produce cortisol in the body have been upregulated because of this constant stress. Being an elite athlete is a synonym for being under severe stress for years. And you don't notice it. I guess you don't pay attention to it when you're younger because most elite athletes tend to be in their, late teens to, early 20s, maybe mid 20s. And around like the early 30s, most of them quit. It's just not possible to maintain it for much longer. So anyway, so I started dabbling in the low carb / paleo diet, lost a little bit of weight the first few months, and I started experiencing insomnia, irritability, anxiety, not depression, maybe like a little bit of low grade even mania because I was working these long hours and people are saying, "Wow, man, you never quit. You just work these 12-hour days. You're a machine." And I took this as a compliment at the time, but in the next few months, I started getting headaches, started getting these weird symptoms in my extremities, like weak extremities, like left or right arm, left or right leg. These almost like electrical zaps in the brain at night. All of these are now known symptoms of high cortisol and high estrogen. And when I talked to the doctor, he kept saying, "No, it has nothing to do with the cortisol. You're probably overexerting yourself." I agree with that part. That's true. But the cortisol very much played a role, in my opinion, because after I lowered the cortisol, all these symptoms disappeared. And since my neurological symptoms continued to deteriorate or exacerbate, eventually the doctor said, "It sounds like you may have a multiple sclerosis or MS. So let me send you for an MRI." So he sent me for an MRI of the spine and the brain. Nothing came back. And he said, "There's nothing I can do for you. I mean, basically, continue maintaining the diet because I think the low carb diet is good. Just don't overexert yourself as much, right?" But he's saying if your symptoms continue, I may have to send you for another MRI and a spinal tap because sometimes the multiple sclerosis, the first signs are in the actual cerebrospinal fluid before the lesions show up on the MRI. When I read about the side effects of the potential side effects of the spinal tap, like paralyzing you from the waist down, or even herniating your brain, which is almost invariably lethal, I said no, I'm not gonna have any of that. So one day I was just searching online for aspirin because, like I said, I'm originally from Bulgaria, and aspirin is considered a wonder drug there. And as we now know, I guess it's a wonder drug everywhere through the works of Dr. Peat. So I was searching for aspirin and multiple sclerosis, and one of Dr. Peat's articles came up on Google. So I read it, and something just clicked. I just said, "Wow, it's just this guy, just the way the thought flows and everything that I've experienced so far, he's speaking it." So I immediately ran to the kitchen of the office, made myself coffee with 4 tablespoons of sugar, drank it, and all my anxiety melted away. And it was a pretty strong coffee. I mean, some people, when they drink coffee, they get an exacerbation of the anxiety. But because I ingest maybe about 80 to 100 grams of sugar with it, I guess that this balanced it. So I quit the low carbing. My sleep immediately improved. Some of the weight that I lost basically was regained, but I also did these tests where there are these machines that measure body fat percentage, and the weight that I regained was not fat, but basically just water. So when you're ingesting carbohydrates, especially if metabolic rate is lower, you tend to retain some of the water that is the byproduct of the oxidation of carbs. Ideally, you should be evaporating it through your skin as perspiration. But I was feeling much better. All my symptoms resolved. There was no need for another MRI. The weakness disappeared. The anxiety disappeared. One thing that happened that my employer was not very happy with, I no longer had the desire to work 12-hour days. But in retrospect, it wasn't natural to want to work that much, right? Companies love it, but employees, they shouldn't be doing this. So long story short, I found Dr. Peat's website, read all of the articles in a single day. I think he has about 30 on the website. Every single thing that he said there made sense, but being a very pedantic person, as a result of my computer science degree, which makes you pay a lot of attention to details, I went and double checked all the reference that he had, read those studies as well, and said, look, nobody has complete access to the truth, but the man has evidence for what he's saying, and I decided to stick with the diet. And knock on wood, I haven't had any symptoms since 2009. So that's how I basically entered into the journey. I embarked on the journey of bioenergetic theory of health, and I've been with it ever since. And over the last couple of years, I'm even starting to do my own studies with a research group in Bulgaria where we publish articles and do our own experiments. And all of these have so far confirmed the things that Dr. Peat has been saying. That basically we're not a car where what kind of gas you put in the car largely doesn't matter for the performance of the car. Basically, it's the opposite. We're the kind of car where whatever the type of gas you put in there can actually determine whether you're going to have a flat tire or not. It sounds laughable in the mechanic analogy. If you talk to a doctor, they're very much for the analogy with the car, the normal analogy, which is, look, if you blow a tire, it has nothing to do with what you ate that for lunch or for dinner previous night. It's got to be some kind of a structural problem or maybe genetic. They love the genetics because it gives them like a free pass to blame everything on something that neither you nor they have control over. So means no, it's nobody's fault, not your fault, not my fault. Let me give you something to control the symptoms and go away. Just don't bother me. And if you don't improve, I'm going to increase the dosage. I'm going to change the drug. Maybe I send you to another specialist. Before you know it, you've seen 20 specialists, which I did when I had these multiple sclerosis symptoms. Not a single one of them said the same thing as the doctor before. Which even back then, without me before I discovered Dr. Peat, who also writes a lot on politics as well and on the incompetence of the medical profession. Even back then, it just gave me like this bad feeling in my stomach. I said, how can it be all these professionals, like none of them agrees, no two of them agree on the same diagnosis. I went to another neurologist. He said, absolute crap. If you don't have a lesion or the MRI, this cannot possibly be multiple sclerosis. I think it's Lyme disease. So let me give you a 6-month course of antibiotics and see what we're said after. I said, nah, I'm not a guinea pig. What do you mean let me give you a 6-month course of antibiotic? And what if I don't improve? He's like, well, that's what I do for most of my patients. And I thought, wow, I would like to meet your patients, see how many of them are alive. And then I went to a third one who said, I don't think so. There's probably something genetic. Do you have like a history of epilepsy or neurodegenerative disease in the family? I'm like, no. He's like, well, you probably do. You just don't know about it because your immediate relatives don't count. It's usually showing up like 4 or 5 generations in the past. And I said, how am I supposed to know that? And how would you know that if those generations affected me? Don't argue with me. I'm the one with the medical degree, and more or less kick me out of the office. So after about 5 or 6 doctors, you realize that either they don't know what they're talking about, or they're all focused on their own theory of what basically they think is wrong, or worse, they're just trying to hook you up on a drug and get rid of you. I mean, get rid of the person who is asking questions. You're not supposed to be asking questions. When you go to the doctor's office, they are advertise it as an environment where you can openly discuss things. But as soon as you ask a question that sort of questions their reasoning, you're done. I mean, they're either going to kick you out, shut you down, or basically say, listen, my way or the highway. This is what I treat. You're not the doctor. You came here for an answer. I'm giving you this answer. If you don't like it, if you don't like my treatments, my proposals, leave. That's it.
I imagine that Georgi is like a doctor's worst nightmare.
I am. I very much am. I admit it openly. I'm not always combative. I do become combative if they say something that's openly contradictory, and that's usually what triggers me to say, hold on a second, just 5 minutes ago you said the exact opposite thing. And most of the time the response is very aggressive. They will say, they will deny that they said it, or they'll say, look, it's the doctor that knows best. And my response to this always is, listen, let me give you an example. In jurisprudence, in regular law enforcement, you have juries composed of random schmoes like me, without medical degrees most of the time, deciding life and death matters based on testimony from experts, right? So if those people can be explained in simple terms what a disease is, or how it manifests itself, or how exactly things work for a sick patient who is suing, or there's some kind of a lawsuit involved with due to malpractice or negligence, then why couldn't I understand it? Why don't you explain it to me in a simpler way so I understand what you're saying? Invariably, not a single one of them was interested in doing that. It was always back to, you either listen to what I say or get out of my office. So I mean, it is what it is. So I eventually gave up on the medical profession. I still see my primary care practitioner because I still maintain health insurance, mostly because of my kids, and requirements to basically have to maintain the insurances. You have to go through, to annual medical exam. Otherwise, they'll cancel your insurance.
Yeah, and but to get blood work every once in a while, I think, to just monitor things.
Yeah, and that's what I use my PCP for. Like he stopped asking questions a long time ago. He stopped pushing me because he's kind of embarrassed, because he thought it was MS or it was like neurologically related. All the symptoms disappeared. He can't deny it. My blood pressure went down. My cholesterol went down. Triglycerides went down. And he keeps saying, like, so what are you exercising? What are you doing to get these results? I said, none. I mean, I do my push-ups. I'm not a sedentary person, but I don't run 6 miles a day like I used to. And I most certainly don't restrict carbs. To which he says, oh my God, like, what are we going to do with you? Like, all my patients are on a low-carb diet. I said, That's why they keep coming back, which may be part of. He's not a bad person. I don't think he's doing it on purpose. He honestly believes that the low carb thing is a good thing, but his other patients are also now starting to see increases in blood pressure, increases in triglycerides, and all of these other biomarkers that are associated with cardiovascular disease and other diseases. And he just puts them on drugs because he cannot bring himself up to the point of thinking that him recommending the low carb diet may be one of the main factors for his patients deteriorating.
So I think one of the great points you brought up is that just a lot of Western medicine just completely disregards how important diet is. And
Yeah.
it's like we're putting in medicine in our body in the form of food every single day. How is this not going to affect how we feel? So that's incredibly frustrating. But I think it's interesting that with that frustration, you stumbled upon Ray Peat, bioenergetic, pro-metabolic way of eating. Can you just provide a brief summary of what that means? Because I think that that's kind of a buzzword sometimes.
So the analogy that I typically use is the one with a car. So the mainstream medicine is the mechanistic view of the car. You have a car, which is your body, right? And then you put gas in the car. As long as the gas as long as there's gas in the car, it largely doesn't matter for the individual parts of the car what kind of gas you put in. Maybe a little bit for the engine, right? But in the grand scheme of things, a car is a car. The gas is the fuel. You put fuel in the car keeps moving, and eventually it's the wear and tear of constantly using the car, which I think is a helpful analogy because we're going to talk about the rate of living theory later. So it's basically the more you drive your car, the faster it's going to break down and the more repairs it's going to need. Conversely, the less often you drive your car, the longer it's going to last and the less repairs it's going to need. But one way or another, the fuel doesn't really matter, right? Well, the bioenergetic theory is kind of the exact opposite. It says, you're not a car. You're composed of cells. These cells are living organisms. They're constantly talking to each other and communicating. And it's very difficult to separate the tire of your car, which is, let's say, your arm or your liver or another organ, from the rest of the car. So all problems in health should be viewed as systemic problems of deficiency of energy production until completely until you have serious evidence to the contrary. Even if you have like a localized cut, like let's say you cut yourself with a knife on the arm, most people intuitively know you're going to feel pain, and that pain actually registers in the brain. It's been shown that even something as localized as like a minor cut on your finger, on your arm, is going to produce a systemic stress effect. It activates the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, which results in the release of cortisol and adrenaline, right? And just activation of the whole system of defensiveness. So your metabolic rate will go down, and then all of these extra resources that the body was using before for high cognitive activity, sexual function, like basically feeling good about yourself and being functional and highly productive. I don't need to tell you or any of the listeners that if you cut yourself, like all of that productivity and in general, like it's like your whole level of liveliness declines because you need to dedicate those resources to fixing the wound, which is a natural mechanism. Now, the same thing happens, every time you get stressed, but without the cut. So you're causing a systemic pathological response every time you're under chronic stress, or you eat the wrong kind of food, or interact with the wrong kind of people, or the weather does not provide a sufficient sunshine and temperature. All of these things are stressors that ultimately lead to the decline in the efficiency of production of energy, and ultimately that affects the structural health of all the cells in your body. We are nothing but an aggregation of cells, but it's not a dumb aggregation of cells. It's a smart one that they constantly talk to each other, and how they interact with each other, and the average health of each cell determines the overall health of the organism. So basically the analogy is every single cell in your body needs energy, not only for functioning, but also for maintaining its structure. So in other words, using the mechanistic analogy of the car, if you don't provide enough or the right kind of fuel, your body will, like the car, which is your body, can actually literally fall apart, which is something that shouldn't be happening, at least with regular cars, but very much happens with the body. It explains, there's a lot of research going back at least 100 years, explains many of these mysterious diseases that we've been seeing lately, especially the increase in cancer and some very rare cancers, neurodegenerative disease, diabetes, heart disease, all of these things these rates are increasing rapidly over the last 20, 30 years. Well, if you're a believer in the genetic theory, you either have to somehow believe that like a gene swept through the entire population over 30 years, and basically that gene is present in most people, and it's causing the rates of these diseases to increase, or there is an environmental factor which is non-genetic, right? And it's working through a different mechanism. Well, the bulk of the evidence points to that environmental factor being various different types of stressors which interfere with the production of energy from food. In other words, think of the body as not only as a car, but as a light bulb stuck between the two poles of a battery, right? One pole is the food, which provides electrons, and the other pole is the oxygen. And if you interfere with the flow of electrons from one pole to the other, going through the battery, the light will be very dim. So the same thing with the body. So if you do anything to interfere with the flow of electrons from food to oxygen, the amount of energy you produce will be insufficient, or you will be done through like suboptimal, frankly, pathological mechanisms such as excessive glycolysis, and that directly leads to disease. And is very similar to how if the light bulb is basically stuck between the poles of the battery, and the connection is not very good, and you get in this dim light which flickers and changes in intensity, it's been shown that this dramatically decreases the lifespan of the light bulb. Actually, very much the same analogy in the human organism as well. If you're eating the wrong kinds of foods, or you're constantly interfering with the flow of electrons from food to the oxygen, eventually structural pathologies result, which medicine they like to keep things strictly separate. They're saying you either have a structural problem, and we're going to discover it through imaging studies, surgery, biomarker testing, etc., etc. And if we can't prove that it's a structural problem, then we're going to tell you they have a functional disorder. And for the functional disorders, they're largely helpless. They're basically it comes down to treating the symptoms. And for many of the structural problems, still, the treatments are very much not treatments at all. Let's say surgery. You have cancer, they cut out the tumor. Within 6 months, it comes back and it has already metastasized. Or they do radiation, or they do chemotherapy. So it turns out that whether you have a structural or a functional problem, medicine has very much degenerated to treating the symptom. And the only branches of medicine that seem to work well are emergency medicine and infectious disease. Basically, they give you the antibiotic. It's very clear there's a pathogen causing a disease. You get rid of the pathogen, or you drastically decrease its population, and basically the disease is cured. These are pretty much the only two branches of medicine that know what they're doing, and everything else is essentially ignorance, negligence, and maybe a little bit of fraud, because doctors are now, even FDA does not call doctors anymore. They're providers, and you're a consumer. So it's all about a market of healthcare services, and like any market, the seller wants to increase their volume, right? So I mean, even though some people say this is a conspiracy theory, I mean, I can send you a number of different articles from very high-profile advocacy groups that are saying we need to increase the consumption of medicine, because they're saying is because they believe it will lead to better outcomes. But we have maybe at least 50 years of evidence accumulating at this point showing that more medical care does not translate actually into better long-term outcomes. United States has the highest per capita consumption of health services than I think the next 7 or 8 countries combined, yet it is at 37th place in terms of long-term outcomes, and recently it shot up to first place in neonatal mortality of all the developed countries that are keeping statistics on that. So clearly something within this healthcare system is not working. And putting aside the fact that it's being over-promoted and oversold and the population is over-medicated, I think the ultimate reason is that it's simply not working. It's based on the wrong theory. And it's based on the idea that you're the mechanic car, you were born like a Mercedes or a BMW based on the genes that your parents gave you, and there's no changing that short of doing gene editing therapy, which has its own, turning us into Frankensteins, but it's a separate discussion. And they're saying this is you, and we can't change who you are, so we're going to focus on managing the symptoms, and that's the best we can do for you so far. Ask yourself this question: how many chronic diseases have been cured over the last 50 years? Zero. Um, I don't think I need to say anything more, right? I mean, like if we, with all of these advances, if we cannot cure something as simple as diabetes type 2, then what point what's the point of consuming, this massive amount of medical services and or products? Clearly, we're spending money on that, and we're deteriorating as a result, or the ways we're not improving. Something there needs to be a radical change, and even something as simple as going to the doctor less often, especially if it's like a specialist, may actually be helpful. There's a famous study which shows that there's a drastic drop in mortality when the top level cardiologists and neurologists in the city hospitals are actually out on vacation or out of town due to a conference. There's like a 40% decrease in mortality. So that's it. I mean, like, I guess for the really advanced and chronic conditions, your doctor is very much likely to hurt you instead of helping you.
Yeah, I battle with these thoughts a lot, but I really do think that no one is out to get us or has evil intentions. I really think that people are trying to help others, and
Right.
we're on our channel, we're all about health, and we're also about farming. So we're starting a regenerative farm, and there are so many parallels in the farming space. Since the Green Revolution after World War II, there's been this huge push on like feeding the world, and it's been this focus on let's choose technology to solve our problems. The same thing is happening in the health sphere, where we're trying to choose technology and pills to solve our problems, when in reality, for both of those situations, for farming and for health, we need to return back to biology. And so on the
Right.
farming side, we're trying to solve these chemistry problems with fertilizers, pesticides, fungicides, the list goes on. When in reality, if we were to just allow nature to function as it should and focus on building the soil biology, the soil health takes care of itself. And then on the human side, I would say that we just there's a lot that we don't know about the human body. There's a lot that's left to, I think a lot of people just assume that all the information that's out there is correct, when in reality,
Right.
a lot of this stuff is theories. And so it's just, we're trying to solve these problems based on theories with technology.
Right.
And I appreciate like the bioenergetic Ray Peat ideology is, hold on, let's just go back to energy production. When our bodies are given the ideal fuel source and sufficient energy, and we're making enough ATP, our body can take care of a lot of things. And correct me if I'm wrong, I don't like the word Ray Peat diet, because I think the diet has just a negative dogma and stigma with it. Ray Peat just brings up nutrition principles, biology, endocrinology, physiology, and then you can implement those how they suit your lifestyle. And so some of the things that he brings up is like metabolic rate and thyroid health are really important in that energy production puzzle. And a simple way to track that would be your body temperature and your pulse rate. And then overall, like food choices for protein, animal-based is our best option. You should not be having these plant-based burgers and soy protein and things like that. For fat sources, you should be choosing saturated fats. And then for carbohydrates, kind of more easier to digest, we want to not disturb our gut too much.
Right.
And then there are a lot more nuances, like you should make sure that you're getting sufficient calcium intake. You should make sure that you're balancing your muscle meat with glycine, so like bone broth and gelatin and things like that. But did I kind of briefly cover?
Really, like, I don't think they can be called a repeat diet. These are they're very solid biochemical principles behind these recommendations, and actually, the amalgamation of his recommendations is present in various cultures around the world individually. For example, eating the whole animal. That's kind of like, it's like scripture in what we call primitive cultures. You go to like pick up Native Americans, or the Amazonian Indians, some of the tribes they're still uncontacted, and every single study that looked at their dietary habits basically verified that they never eat only the muscle meats. In fact, they often consider them so toxic or substandard type of food, they will feed them to the dogs or the animals that they keep there, or cats that they keep as pets, right? They will always try to eat the organ meats, the skin, they'll boil the bones, that kind of thing. So they must have realized through centuries of experimentation that eating pure muscle meats is really is not a very good practice, right?
So I think I heard this from Chris Masterjohn. I believe over 50% of the animal is gelatin, is
That's
glycemic.
right. That's right.
And so, yeah, now at the supermarkets these days, you don't see any gelatin sources. It's just muscle meat after muscle meat after muscle meat. So yeah, no, you bring up a great point that a lot of these principles that he brings up, they're so foreign to like the day to day, but like it's kind of returning back to a lot of like principles that have been well developed. But we'll get into some conflicting views on it. So do you mind if we kind of just go through some of the, so I polled our audience, and people put in a box, like, what are your biggest criticisms of the Ray Peat nutrition strategy? Right. Let's just call it pro-metabolic bioenergetic for now, because I just
pro-metabolic bioenergetic with a focus on oxidizing carbs instead of the other macronutrients.
Correct. Okay. So let's start with cholesterol. So I think that on like the plant-based side, the recommendation of, you should focus your protein intake on animal foods. That's a high intake of cholesterol. And we were touching on this before the call. So what is your response to, that type of diet is high in cholesterol?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, even the most diehard proponents of the connection between cholesterol and heart disease recognize that, first of all, causative link has never been proven. Second of all, it's only the oxidized type of cholesterol that has been shown to be present in the lesions, the cardiovascular lesions in the blood vessels. Recently, FDA, as I mentioned before we started recording, FDA has reviewed all of the available evidence and has come out with a statement, a reversal of its 50-year-long policy on dietary cholesterol, which unfortunately hasn't made its way down and trickled down to the individual doctors. But as of right now, actually, as of last year, FDA came out very quietly with a statement and said, we no longer think that restricting dietary cholesterol has any impact on your cardiovascular risk. Now, they didn't go as far as saying that there is no connection between high cholesterol and heart disease, which would have been devastating for the sale of statins and other cholesterol-lowering drugs and all kinds of dietary approaches aimed at lowering cholesterol. But they said the amount of cholesterol you ingest in your diet has zero relevance for your cardiovascular disease risk. I think that's huge. But then I also looked at the studies that they cited as the basis of that reversal. And some of those studies actually found even inverse correlation between dietary cholesterol and cardiovascular risk. So FDA kind of told you the truth, but not the whole truth. The whole truth is that the preponderance, the cumulative evidence right now suggests that if anything, that increasing dietary cholesterol will actually may even lower your risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, multiple high-profile doctors and even medical institutes have come out and said, look, we've been looking, the cholesterol link is too simplistic. It looks like right now, cholesterol is just an innocent bystander. It's like blaming firefighters for the fire, right? They always go together, right? But nobody's blaming firefighters for starting the fire. Maybe some of them do if they're nefarious, but most of them don't, right? They're actually helping. And if you look at the evidence on what cholesterol does, it has a reparative function on the blood vessel wall. So it combines with white blood cells and some fats and a little bit of calcium, and basically starts to plug literal holes into your blood vessel. Now the question is, what is causing those holes to happen? And the answer so far seems to be chronic inflammation. So a number of high-profile doctors and organizations have come out and said cardiovascular disease is a chronic inflammatory disorder, and it should be treated as such. We should not be messing with cholesterol because cholesterol has multiple crucial, indispensable functions in the organism. And if we interfere with the synthesis of cholesterol or restrict it in the diet, which now is out because FDA said don't mess with dietary cholesterol, it has no effect, right? But if we interfere with the synthesis of cholesterol, which is what the statin drugs do, then we may be triggering, preparing for some really nasty neurological diseases down the road, such as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which is largely lethal. Very few people have survived it. And now there's already established link between statins and ALS. the abbreviation for amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Also, now there's a link between statins and multiple sclerosis, link between statins and Parkinson's disease, link between statins and even mad cow disease, which is the prion disease, these misfolded proteins that are also infectious. So if you mess with cholesterol, there are plenty of studies that show that it's not a good idea in general, because even though it may not cause immediate problems, down the road you're changing the structure of the cell, because cholesterol is the major component of the so-called cellular membrane. Now, whether you believe in membranes or not, that it's your choice, but cholesterol is a big component of the cell. And when you don't provide enough cholesterol, this increases the fluidity of the cell and basically makes the cell exposed to a lot of different toxins that may be floating around in the bloodstream. You may be ingesting through food, you may be exposed to them through air, water, or like occupational hazardous professions, such as working in a metal factory or a pesticide producing factory, or even like a drug producing factory for pharmaceutical drugs. So the more fluid your cell is, the more permeable its membrane is, which largely depends on how much cholesterol the body can supply to the cells, then the higher risk for a number of different immediate toxicities, which also ultimately result in chronic toxicities as well. So first of all, so again, okay, raising cholesterol on a Ray Peat diet. Actually, the keto diet also raises cholesterol. If you're eating all of these saturated fats, they've been shown to raise cholesterol as well. And recently, a study was published, I think it was in JAMA, which is kind of like the holy grail of medical journals, at least in the United States. It said, we've been looking at cholesterol the wrong way. And yes, we know that unsaturated fats lower cholesterol, or more specifically LDL, which is the protein carrying cholesterol. And we know that saturated fats raise it, but actually, for a long time, we thought that lower LDL is good and high LDL is bad. Now it turns out that it's actually maybe the other way around. And the explanation they provided is, look, when you somehow restrict the synthesis of cholesterol or the dietary cholesterol, because the cell needs that this cholesterol, LDL unloads whatever cholesterol it has, it unloads it into the cell. So it has less cholesterol left to carry around. That's why you see a decrease in the synthesis of LDL, which is a protein produced by the liver, because there isn't just that much cholesterol to carry around, right? All of that cholesterol is needed by the cell because its membrane is becoming more permeable. So LDL dumps its cholesterol into the cell, and as a result, the body produces less LDL because there is less cholesterol left to carry around. Now, when you eat saturated fats, we actually have a protective effect on the cell. They decrease its permeability. Basically, you have more cholesterol that's left over that's not necessarily needed for the structural role into the cell. So LDL rises in order to be able to bind this cholesterol and help it circulate around and also carry it back to the liver for disposition if it's not needed. So in fact, the reason polyunsaturated fats were lowering LDL, it's actually bad because they're increasing cell permeability, right? And then the body says, okay, let me dump more cholesterol into the cell, which ultimately will result in lower levels of LDL, but for a bad reason, because you are creating a deficiency of cholesterol in the cell by giving statins or restricting dietary cholesterol. And there's very weak correlation between LDL and future cardiovascular disease. However, there's very strong correlation between the levels of inflammatory biomarkers such as the C-reactive protein, CRP, or erythrocyte sedimentation rate, ESR, and both of these are used to diagnose chronic inflammatory disorders such as rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, psoriasis, and then even some other autoimmune conditions like multiple sclerosis. But they're also very reliable biomarkers of a future cardiovascular event. So more evidence that it's the inflammation that's causing the damage for the cardiovascular system, and then cholesterol is being used to try to repair it, maybe in a suboptimal manner. But if you don't repair it, eventually you can have a ruptured blood vessel, right, which can have devastating and often lethal consequences. So the body is doing the best it can to repair the damage, but that damage is caused by something else, and that something else is inflammation, and that inflammation is largely driven by the amount of polyunsaturated fats in the diet and consequently stored in your body, because about 80% of the inflammatory response is created through the enzymes cyclooxygenase and lipoxygenase, abbreviated as COX and LOX, and those two enzymes use polyunsaturated fats, also called PUFAs, to synthesize inflammatory mediators. So COX inhibitors and LOX inhibitors such as aspirin and montelukast and a number of different inhibitors of these two enzymes have been known for over 100 years to have highly therapeutic effects for preventing and even treating cardiovascular disease. I don't need to tell you the famous association that if you feel like you're about to have a heart attack, chew a tablet of aspirin, right? One reason is that it thins your blood and basically reduces the risk of a clot. Another reason, by taking aspirin chronically, is that it decreases the synthesis of the inflammatory burden, the inflammatory mediators from polyunsaturated fats. But what will be the best way to prevent this at the very top? Limit the amount of polyunsaturated fats in the diet, right? So when people are saying the high carb, like the Ray Peat diet will raise your cholesterol, yes, it will, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Cholesterol only becomes dangerous when there is already present inflammatory damage, and even then, its role is largely protective, and it takes decades for the cholesterol into the blood cell wall to start becoming oxidized, which, by the way, also depends on polyunsaturated fats because it's a process largely driven by lipid peroxidation, right? So as you immediately see, the cholesterol really is just a repair mechanism. Now, can it become dangerous? Sure, but not because it itself is incredibly dangerous. It's because of the pro-inflammatory, anti-metabolic environment created through stress, polyunsaturated fats, toxins that we're exposed through in the diet and in our environment. And basically, that's it. It's the stressful Western lifestyle combined with diets that were never developed for health reasons. They were mostly developed, all commercial foods, I don't need to tell you, they developed mostly with the profit motive in mind. And that's how we end up with cholesterol being blamed, while cholesterol is simply the one of the few repair mechanisms that the body has, albeit imperfect, but better than nothing, because you would rather have a plugged and potentially blocked blood vessel than have a blood vessel rupture. It's a major blood vessel. If it's the abdominal aorta, one of the large aortas coming into the heart, it can be lethal within 30 seconds. So you don't want that, right? In general, internal hemorrhaging events are much more deadly than the ischemic events, which are the blocked vessel. So if you have a hemorrhaging stroke, which is a blood vessel in your brain bursted, much higher mortality rate than the ischemic stroke, which is what people are saying is caused by the cholesterol. There's a blockage in a blood vessel in the brain, and that's why you get like the ischemic event, which is the blockage event. The ischemic ones are much less deadly than the hemorrhagic ones. So even if you believe in the theory that cholesterol is a cause of heart disease, it's less of a problem than if you didn't have enough of it, because then you're going to have a hemorrhaging event, and those are terrible.
Yeah, I think if we just like take a step back and realize, okay, all this stuff is now coming out that cholesterol may not be bad, that is going to like remove the legs of the table of conventional medicine, because statins, dietary guidelines about why vegetable oils are good, all of these are focused on lowering cholesterol.
Right.
And so just think about like the number of things that would have to be reversed and changed. And that's a lot of work, and that's a lot of profit potential loss. And so It's going to be really interesting over these next couple of years to see if any of that information is like widely talked about, because the number of companies that would have to would go out of business or completely change the way that they present their thing. Like you still walk around the grocery store, low cholesterol and like all this stuff. And so it's just, cholesterol is almost like the single most important thing that a lot of like conventional health recommendations are trying to lower. And it would just have a huge effect if that was more widespread. But I think that was a great summary.
Doctors, and they said, oh yes, actually 3 out of the 5 hadn't heard about the FDA release. I said, come on guys, this happened like almost 2 years ago. Like where have you been? Well, unless we hear from our local state health board, we are actually not required to follow FDA guidelines. Really? Because I'm looking at this, and like you said, I'm becoming a nightmare for any doctor, because then I start quoting these things that turns out that they are laws, they have to follow them, and of course doctors immediately get defensive. Nobody wants to get sued. They don't know who this guy Georgi is. Maybe he's recording them, right? But it's very difficult to have a normal, non-confrontational discussion with a doctor, even friends, because as soon as you catch them of like them not knowing something very basic, they start becoming defensive. or like even if they don't become defensive, they don't know what to tell you, but they're not going to change their practice overnight because so much money and effort is invested into. They've signed deals with drug companies to maybe get Lipitor and Crestor, which is the cholesterol lowering drugs. Maybe they've bought like a huge supply of these drugs, and now they need to sell all of them in order to recoup their like investment slash losses. So
Yep.
it's going to take years before this information trickles down. And let's see. I mean, I think without a doubt we will see changes in dietary guidelines at the individual level. But if you know, I've seen like other changes that are trickling down from FDA. On average, takes about 5 years before you even see them manifesting at the local level. Everybody's careful. Everybody's saying, well, FDA has been wrong before. Yes, true, right? So just because FDA said no, we no longer worry about dietary cholesterol, we don't know if FDA is not going to come back tomorrow and say, you know what, we were wrong. So let's worry about dietary cholesterol. So they're kind of like taking a very hands-off approach and being very conservative about it. But a lot of it is driven by simply by inertia.
Yeah.
If you tell your patients, let's say your primary care doctor, most of them are, you know, well, many of them are young, but like the ones that I've seen are usually like in their 50s and 60s. If you have patients that you've seen for 20, 30 years, and you've been nagging them about their cholesterol for 30 years, it's not going to help you. I mean, maybe it's the patient to blame, but suddenly you come out and say, hey, guess what? I was wrong all these 30 years. Don't worry about cholesterol anymore. Chances are this will affect your reputation in these people's eyes, and they may, you know, they may have less of a inclination to listen to you about other advice that you may have that may actually be valid.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to next topic, but your discussion there is like a great lead into it, because you brought up, hey, it's actually cholesterol, dietary cholesterol is not actually causing these heart instances, these heart attacks and strokes and stuff. It's actually inflammation. And if anyone knows about bioenergetic pro-metabolic approach, sugar sources are often a big part of the diet. It's not the only part of the diet, but one includes fruit, squashes, honey, and some people include sugar. My sister and I don't include sugar that much, but we do consume a lot of fruit and honey. And so you saying, hey, inflammation is actually the cause of these heart things. A lot of people are going to point to the Ray Peat community and say, well, sugar is causing that inflammation. And how can you deny when you see articles? So I'm just pulling up something from Healthline because they just list a lot of like references. So
Right.
Too much added sugar is linked to inflammation. Several animal studies have shown that a diet high in added sugar leads to obesity, insulin resistant, increased gut permeability, and low-grade inflammation. Human studies confirm the link between added sugar and high inflammatory markers, et cetera,
Okay.
et cetera. And so people can go to this and look at
Yeah, can you leave like the title and then the first paragraph, because I want to address all of these things. First of all, it says too much sugar, too much added sugar is linked to inflammation. So there are two kinds of studies: epidemiological studies and intervention studies. Epidemiological studies cannot prove a cause. All they can tell you is, look, we took these two groups, one group with a high sugar consumption, the other one with low sugar consumption, and then the group with a high sugar consumption had higher rates of this or that disease, right? That in no way establishes causality. It could be a number of different things. People with high inflammation may be more prone to consume sugar for a variety of reasons, maybe because it helps them, maybe because the high inflammation creates a state of low dopamine, which makes people crave comfort foods, has been shown multiple times, makes them crave alcohol, makes them crave drugs, makes them crave sex, and makes all of these dopamine raising events unsatisfying. They don't, because of inflammation, they can raise dopamine to the point where they experience satisfaction. So they keep doing it more and more and more and more. Anyways, long story short, none of these studies that I've seen that blame sugar are actually interventional. Some of them are, and it says there's several animal studies. Now, most of the vast majority of the actual interventional studies we actually have, you have groups of animals, and then you change their diet, right? And you manipulate their diet to show a causative link, right? In a tightly controlled fashion. Then most of these are done with animals, mostly because if you try to do it with humans, you're going to have to feed those diets for years in a highly controlled fashion before you see some effect. But with rodents, because of the shorter lifespan, higher metabolism, you can see changes in a few months. But here's what they do. So most of the intervention studies are with animals, and guess what? They said diet high in added sugar. So that's different than a high carb diet. So in other words, these animals, in vast majority of cases, because I've looked at these studies, vast majority of cases, they were already eating crappy diet, which was high in polyunsaturated fats. And then in many cases, the so-called added sugar was extra starch. So let's talk a little bit about the inflammatory component, the inflammatory effects of sugars. Now, there is no known mechanism through which a simple sugar such as glucose, fructose, maltose, and even lactose can cause inflammation directly when consumed through the diet. There is no pathway through which they can raise an inflammatory mediator or be a precursor to an inflammatory mediator. Now, all of these diets that I've seen that blame sugar, the interventional ones, which are almost invariably with animals, they always administer additional sugar on top of an already pro-inflammatory diet because of the high PUFA, and the sugar that was administered was usually in the form of starch. Now, what's so different about starch? People say, well, when you eat starch, eventually it becomes glucose. Aren't they the same? Not at all. So, first of all, when you're eating resistant starch, most of it does not get metabolized properly in the stomach and the small intestine, because hence the name resistant. And then it reaches your colon in a largely undigested fashion where it becomes food for bacteria. Now, most of the bacteria in your colon, when you supply them with food, they start to divide and basically grow. And in the process, so it increases the turnover of the microbiome in your colon. Now, when you increase the turnover rate, some of the older bacteria that dies, so when they die, they rupture, their lower ruptures, and releases something called endotoxin. So that endotoxin, if you're chronically eating this resistant starch, you're chronically increasing the turnover of bacteria in your colon, you're going to have higher amounts of endotoxin in your colon. Now, over time, this endotoxin is a highly inflammatory component. You can actually kill any organism by injecting a sufficient amount of it directly into the bloodstream. But at lower amounts, it creates this chronic inflammatory reaction in the colonic wall. And over time, the barrier, the so-called gut barrier, gets compromised, and the colon becomes permeable not only to endotoxin, but a number of different unmetabolized starch particles. So these things end up getting into the bloodstream, where they immediately trigger a very, very nasty, high-grade inflammatory reaction, both the endotoxin and the preserved starch particles. And in fact, it can trigger a lethal either inflammatory reaction through a cytokine storm and multi-organ failure in the case of endotoxin. And in fact, most people with COVID-19 now in the hospitals, or with flu, or most infectious diseases, are dying in the hospital from multi-organ failure caused by a cytokine storm. And now evidence is showing that's mostly driven by endotoxin. So even if you put the endotoxin aside, the presorption of undigested starch particles into the bloodstream immediately triggers an allergic reaction, which is another type of inflammatory response. It can actually cause a lethal anaphylactic shock. So if a person, let's say a chronic alcoholic or a person with inflammatory bowel disease, in both cases, their gut barrier is highly compromised. If they have a sufficient presorption of starch into their bloodstream, they can die from an anaphylactic reaction. But it only happens with starch particles, because they're complex molecules and the body treats them. They're actually present in the walls of many pathogens, especially bacteria. So endotoxin and the undigested starch particles activate a highly inflammatory receptor known as TLR4, toll receptor 4, and that triggers the whole inflammatory cascade with the release of prostaglandins, leukotrienes, nitric oxide, histamine, serotonin, etc. Speaking of serotonin, 90% of the serotonin in your body is produced in the gastrointestinal tract. So if you're chronically feeding your bacteria foods that are hard to digest and they were not properly digested and absorbed in the stomach and small intestine as they should, then you'll be in a state of chronic hyperserotonemia. Now, that may be a topic for a separate conversation, but at this point, medicine is slowly starting to recognize that serotonin is nothing like the happiness hormone that has been told for the last 50 years. In fact, many drugs now that are being brought onto the market that are capable of treating diseases that were recently considered irreversible and lethal, such as pulmonary fibrosis or heart fibrosis, also known as heart failure, or even cirrhosis, are actually, all of these drugs, without exception, are potent antagonists / blockers of one or more of the serotonin receptors. Conversely, people taking serotonergic drugs, such as SSRI drugs for depression, most commonly prescribed, these people have a much higher rate of fibrotic disorders, which includes the cirrhosis, heart fibrosis, lung fibrosis, gastrointestinal fibrosis, and pretty much any fibrotic disorder that you can think of, systemic sclerosis, which is basically a form of systemic fibrosis, both on organs and on skin. And it's been shown that all of these disorders can be prevented either by blocking serotonin or blocking the TLR4, the endotoxin receptor, which is activated by endotoxin, and you get endotoxin by eating resistant starch, and or by the persorption of undigested starch particles into your bloodstream. So which means most of the studies legitimately that found increased inflammation from sugars were studies that, first of all, fed sugar in the form of starch, more often than not, on top of an already pro-inflammatory diet high in polyunsaturated fats. And then also, basically, all of these studies relied on the endotoxin and the starch component in order to trigger these inflammatory reactions. Now, studies that were fully controlled, such as they fed, let's say, high carb diet, which is 60 to 80% carbohydrates, and when they basically control the animal studies. So if you look at the study, if you look at the diets of these people, they simply consumed an extra 80 grams of sugar on top of their normal diet. That is not good evidence that sugar is pro-inflammatory. A good evidence would be you take these men or women or whatnot, separate them into different groups, and control their full micronutrient pattern. In other words, you have one group that eats, let's say, 70% carbs, and the rest coming from protein and fats. You have another group that consumes about 60% to 70% fat, which would be enough to put them into a ketosis state, which is what many of the low carb / paleo people recommend. And then you have another group which consumes, let's say, 30 to 40% from protein, which would make that a high protein group. And you follow these people for a few months. Only then you can tell fairly reliably whether it's the sugar that's causing the inflammation or something else. And by the way, when you feed them sugar, starch, even though technically is a sugar, it's actually a precursor to sugar, and its metabolism matters a lot when it comes to inflammation. If you feed these people the high sugar diet, if you feed them preformed sugars such as glucose, fructose, lactose, maltose, dextrose, then that will actually be much more supportive of whether sugar is pro or anti-inflammatory. And the few studies that I've seen that use such highly controlled diets demonstrate drastically lower inflammatory response in the high sugar diet, dramatically improved insulin sensitivity, and also like lower glycemic response after a meal. Which takes us over to the other argument: isn't sugar pro-insulinogenic, and will it cause diabetes? Well, starch is known to do that, but starch metabolizes into glucose. Glucose, it has a very high glycemic index. If you're eating regular table sugar, 50% glucose, 50% fructose, much lower glycemic index than eating starch or pure glucose. And if you're eating fruits, most ripe fruits are up to 70% fructose. And fructose, pure fructose, is now actually used as treatment or as a sugar substitute in many countries for diabetic patients. So diabetic people can eat fructose and it does them a lot of good. In fact, in some cases, it reverses their non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which almost every diabetic person has, type 2 diabetes, right? But at the very least, it doesn't exacerbate their state. So if you're eating ripe fruit or honey or even table sugar, you're going to be causing less damage or less of an insulin response than if you're eating the starches, whether simple or resistant, as your doctors are saying you should be consuming.
Okay, so a lot to unpack there. Let's go back to this study really quickly. So this one says low to moderate sugar sweetened beverage consumption impairs glucose and lipid metabolism and promotes inflammation, a randomized control trial. So I went down to like the study design, and you brought up a great point. These drinks are added on to the meals. And so this kind of goes back to the cholesterol argument that we were having. Is sugar the fireman who is at the site of inflammation? Is the sugar causing it, or is it just could sugar potentially be adding fuel to the fire from the inflammation that was already there?
Right.
So you mentioned that many of these studies that talk about this are adding sugar drinks on top of a diet already. Right. And that you brought up that there were some well-designed studies that showed lower inflammation with fructose intake. Do you by chance know, like, do you have that reference?
I do have it. Actually, if you go to Google right now, and
Yeah.
it's an amazing study, but like I said, most of them are with animals simply because some of these studies will consider it unethical to feed humans like a truly high sugar diets, which will be 70% carbs, right?
Right.
But there are plenty of studies with animals, and the one that's really, really striking because it actually proves my point perfectly. It was a study with rats, which showed that if you feed the rats, there were several groups, and the one that was truly high carb but low fat and relatively low protein, they were allowed to drink Coca-Cola freely, and they basically drank the equivalent of 4,000 additional calories per day from Coke, right? So a truly, truly high carb diet while also maintaining the fat component low and the protein component low. And these animals, not only they didn't gain weight, they actually lost weight. So if you go to Google right now, we'll probably be able to find them.
Okay.
And if you type in Google Ray space Peat space forum, and then drinking Coke freely. And then this should bring up the study which says that drinking Coke freely quadruples metabolism and, basically leads to weight loss and things like that. There we go.
So this here.
Yes, a truly well-designed study that basically demonstrates how the carbohydrates, especially and again, they're saying chronic consumption of fructose, which is great because the low carb community is saying, oh, all added sugars are bad, but fructose is particularly bad because it ruins your liver, it makes you fat, etc., etc., etc. Well, they used actually Coca-Cola right there under methods. You can see that was the source of the fructose, but in reality, it was stable sugar. That's what Coca-Cola is sweetened with. And they were drinking, this Coke freely, and it was the equivalent. I think we calculated had a discussion on the forum. It was the equivalent of an average adult consuming 4,000 more calories, assuming you're consuming about 2,000 daily, consuming extra 2,000 calories from drinking Coke and losing weight instead of gaining. I mean, what more than that do you want as proof that if you actually truly control the diet and jack up the carbohydrate component, but with simple sugars, not the starches, right? Then you're basically getting a strikingly beneficial end result.
Wait, but it says that it led to unfavorable alterations to the lipid profile.
Yes, it increased their triglycerides a little bit, but that's about it. I mean, however, if you look at the groups, the different groups that they had, all of them kind of jump in triglycerides. Yes, the Coke gave them a little, but again, I'm not advising that you should be drinking 4,000 additional calories daily from Coke. This study was done, I think in a grotesque fashion to prove that in even extreme cases where you double your daily calories on top of your daily calories in the form of Coke, which everybody's telling you soft drinks will kill you, man. Don't you dare ever touch them. Actually didn't. In fact, it led to weight loss. Yes, at the expense of slightly increased triglycerides. Well, I would like to see a follow-up study where they drank only 1,000 calories on top of their normal ones with Coke and kept the fat low. I suspect the results would have been the same without the change in the lipid profile. Feel free to look at the studies. Other people pointed out the lipid profile thing too, but it's not what the study makes it sound to be. I think it's actually done. Many of these studies, if you try to publish in a reputable journal and title your study, "Drinking Coca-Cola makes you lose weight and turns you into a healthy beast," I think this journal would simply not accept that study.
Yeah.
They'll ask you to come up with something.
Well, okay, so I think you brought up a great point. Like that study, it creates unrealistic conditions. Who
Right.
in their right mind is consuming that much fructose? And you shouldn't be, because you're not consuming enough vitamins and minerals.
Exactly.
With that. You're just consuming a ton of just basically calories.
Right.
And so context gets lost a lot. It's like, if you're, again, this study was almost trying to like poke holes in some arguments and just test certain things. No
That's
one
exactly
is
what it was.
advising to just slam a bunch of Coke and sugar. But you have to, this is something that someone brought up to me when we were keto and carnivore. Someone asked, why is it that fruitarians, unideal diet, because they are not consuming like animal proteins and valuable nutrients in animals, muscle meat, and also like fat soluble vitamins. However, why are fruitarians relatively lean? and they're consuming a lot of fructose, that argue like, so that just like example didn't really follow along with the claims that, oh, every ounce of fructose that you consume leads to straight fat gain.
Well, again, I mean, like the fruitarians are keeping their dietary fat relatively low. Like probably at some point they're probably not consuming much of it at all. There isn't much fat in the right fruits, right? So again, it goes back to when people tell you high carb diets will make you fat. What they usually mean is, oh, I just had this massive burger from McDonald's. Let me shove 2 Cokes on top of it. Yes, that will contribute more. You'll gain more weight than if you only ate the burger, right?
So,
But
Georgi, this is
diet. Yeah.
this is where I think that if someone has these rules about like fructose and like, oh, I shouldn't be consuming that sugar because it helps them avoid these foods that are high in PUFAs and sugars, the real disaster, like for example, donuts and
Right.
like pastry
Right.
goods, like, is that really a bad thing? Like, if someone struggles with like implementing a diet perfectly and instead they do like, okay, I should limit my like high sugar intake because it helps me better control my diet and the food that I'm eating. Um, I don't have a problem with that. Like, I think that there could be a time and place for people to follow a low sugar approach because
Yeah.
it helps them in life. They don't have as many triggers. I'm someone that I have like extreme control. That's sometimes a bad thing. But I'm able to control my food intake. And so I enjoy pursuing these like optimal way of eating. I don't have like binge tendencies or like cravings, and I don't go for like pastries or donuts when I'm stressed. And
Right.
so I think that if someone is struggling with that and this other way of eating where they kind of they avoid consuming processed sugars because it helps them restrict these deadly combinations of PUFAs and sugars like donuts, I think that that's okay.
Well, it's perfectly fine. I mean, I'll say this: it's better to consume the donut that's high in PUFA with some sugar than consume a donut that's just a PUFA and the starch. That's probably the worst thing you can do. Like a non-sweetened Krispy Kreme donut only has the dough and the PUFA is a much more terrible thing than a sweetened one because the simple sugars, and they are using sugar, or at least high fructose corn syrup, will actually buffer some of the pro-endotoxin effects of the starch. And also, since you're ingesting this PUFA is much more dangerous when it's floating around in your bloodstream. So when you're eating that extra sugar, it's going to trigger an insulin response and shuttle that PUFA away from your bloodstream into your fatty tissues, where though not ideal, because it will contribute to a low-grade inflammation, it's much less dangerous than having that PUFA float around in your bloodstream for hours, which is what it will do if you don't trigger a sufficient insulin response. And then most of the organ failures that are seen in people with diabetes, in the hospital with cytokine storms, and now with COVID, are now known to be directly triggered by either endotoxin or drastically elevated levels of non-esterified fatty acids, mostly PUFA. Now, PUFA is preferentially stored when you eat it, which kind of shows you your body doesn't really want it floating around. The saturated fats gets preferentially oxidized, but also when PUFA is stored into your fatty tissue, when you're under stress and cortisol and adrenaline are rising, that PUFA gets preferentially released. So you can give yourself, and it's been shown, there's another study which we can probably find if you Google it, most marathon runners towards the end of the marathon are in a stage of mild to moderate kidney failure. Guess why? Because after about 20 minutes of running, all of their glycogen stores are gone, and they have to rely on fat to complete the marathon. And most of that fat, because it's coming from their stores, most of the fat flooding their bloodstream is PUFA. And it's really dramatic. When I show this to people, they say, oh my God, I'm getting a kidney failure from running like half a marathon. And it says most people are. Now, they do recover because as soon as they finish the marathon, they chug a Gatorade, they eat something sweet, whatnot, lowers the levels of free fatty acids in the blood. And if they're younger, their kidneys will recover because it's acute kidney failure. But does it sound like something good that you want to cause yourself on a regular basis? Guess what? Every time you're creating an abnormal lipolytic effect through stress or by eating extra PUFA, you're directly ruining your organs. And whether you'll recover or not, largely depends on how young and healthy you are. And with advancing age and declining health, these foods become that much more dangerous.
Okay, but so now I'm gonna. This is another criticism. You talking about how PUFAs destroy organs.
Right.
There is a lot of people saying that fructose causes liver failure. So it's basically liver is inundated with sugar, and so the liver will be focused on clearing the sugar rather than detoxing, and you get papers showing that like excess fructose.
Please show me that study that fructose causes liver failure, because I can show at least 10 that show it can cure it.
So
that's not alcoholic fatty liver disease. It's different from liver failure. And if you look at the study, I mean, I think I've seen that one. They mostly talk about the role, because they're saying, look, most of the fructose, all of the fructose is metabolized by the liver. Not true. The liver has the highest capacity for metabolizing it, but all organs like fructose, especially in pregnant women. The fetus, like in the what is it called, the amniotic fluid, is actually the sugar that's predominantly present in there, and it's providing nutrition to the baby and protecting it. It's predominantly fructose. So basically the liver processes about 80% of fructose that you ingest. But here's the thing, that study and the ones that I've seen invariably demonstrate feeding fructose or a high fructose diet on top of an already diet with sufficient amount of fat. It has never been a truly controlled diet, just like the study with the rats, where you kept you basically increase carbs, but decrease another macronutrients to maintain an isocaloric diet, right? So if you do that, then basically the liver has a choice between processing the fats that are coming in and processing the fructose. And it does have a preference for the fructose. So most of these fats, the liver will not be able to excrete. It will convert to triglycerides, and will either shuttle back to the bloodstream for storage into the fat, or you actually have to store inside of itself, which they're saying it leads to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. However, if you lower your fat intake commensurably with the increased fructose intake, or in general sugar intake, you actually, there are many studies showing drastic reversal of not only non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, but even cirrhosis in hardcore established alcoholics. So it's the fat that's damaging the liver. It's not the sugar. And if you combine the two, we're getting similar outcomes as the one with inflammation. Yes, if you throw extra sugar on top of an already pro-inflammatory diet, you're probably not going to get a very good result. However, if you truly design a high carb diet, even if it's pure fructose, you will not see, I challenge you to find me a study that shows groups that in which one case you had, let's say, 60 to 70 to 80% of the calories coming in as carbs, even as pure fructose, and that some kind of a liver pathology in that group. I don't know of a single such study.
So it's really interesting. Like we go back to that combination of the fats and the carbs, and
there does seem to be an optimal ratio. So if you're eating a 30% fat diet, 30 to 40%, which happens to be the average diet for most people, in clinical research, that's already considered a high fat diet. You're already causing lipemia. You're already causing elevation of the free fatty acids in the blood. Means your liver is already overburdened. Now, ideally, if you're keeping the fats at 20% or lower, your liver can actually oxidize most of the saturated fat. It can glucuronidize the polyunsaturated fat, so you actually excrete it out with your urine, and then you will not see much of a lipemic response after eating a meal. If the lipids in your blood rise after a meal, and they actually have several levels which they consider like tolerable, potentially toxic, and then clinically toxic, then if you're staying at the first layer, you're probably okay. And if you add more sugar on top of that, you'll still be okay. In fact, because glucuronic acid is synthesized from glucose, you actually are helping the liver detox fats if you're keeping the fat at an acceptable level and adding more glucose or fructose to it. Because fructose, when it gets metabolized, it still ultimately goes, like it circumvents one or two steps in the glycolysis pathway, but ultimately it's metabolized similarly to glucose through the same pathways. So it still can be used to synthesize glucuronic acid. Now, if you're eating 30% fat, any sugar you throw on top of that will largely not get metabolized because of the Randle cycle, right? So now what does the body do with the extra sugar? Well, it's got only two choices: store as glycogen or converting to fats. So that's probably why we're seeing these responses of extra sugar, added sugar. I want to emphasize added sugar. This is not the same as a high carb diet. Added sugar on top of an actually high fat diet probably not going to do you much good. It will result into storage of that preferably, which is the less harmful result. Storage of most of these carbs as glycogen, which mostly happens in the liver and the muscles, mostly in the liver. You can store about half a kilogram and maybe another half a kilogram in your muscles. But after that, this food has to go somewhere, and then you have the so-called de novo lipogenesis, and it's been shown that it only starts in humans after you consume more than 500 grams of sugars a day. But key point, this limit only applies if the fat is kept relatively low. If you consume sufficient amount of fats, and that seems to be independent for each person, but above 30%, you're very much asking for trouble. Then at that point, almost any amount of carbs you consume on top of the minimum amount that's necessary for your brain and vital organs like the spleen and even the liver, then any amount on top of that is going to start getting converted into glycogen and fats. And basically, the more fat you eat, the more you're going to waste that extra glucose as fat. So, but if you keep the fat low, most of the glucose will get oxidized. Whatever little is left as non-oxidized glucose will probably get converted to glycogen, and very little of it will go towards the synthesis of fats.
Okay, so I would say that like this is the biggest place where I differ from a lot of the Ray Peat nutrition strategy, because I'm coming from many years of amenorrhea and hormone issues, and
Right.
You can't deny that there's issues when one limits their fat consumption with hormones. And then I really feel like you're also limiting your nutrient intake on really important vitamins and minerals, such as like the fat soluble vitamins. And so that's my biggest, not criticism. It's just, that's my biggest difference. I still consume a good amount of fats, but I think that I still maintain a relatively like normal amount of calories for my body. I'm not like consuming a ton of calories. I think consuming 3,000 calories of really high fat and really high carbs is not a good idea.
It's not,
But I still like, I'm not strict about it at all, but I still consume a good amount of fat, I would say. I've drastically reduced from when I was zero carb, obviously. But I just think that there's some hormone problems that one can get. And then another point, I come from someone who's been aggressively lean my whole life, always showing my six pack and like having this focus on being lean, and then finally getting to this place of like, it's okay to have fat. There's not, it's not the worst thing. Ray Peat talks about how female hormones are optimal at a certain body fat percentage for females. So I think that this conversation changes a little bit when we talk about optimal hormones. So what are your thoughts there? I guess that's another criticism of Ray Peat is if we do low fat, I don't like the word low anymore.
It's not low fat. Maybe I misspoke. It shouldn't be higher than 30% because then it's high fat and you're causing a lipemic response and you're activating the Randle cycle, right? But if you're assuming, let's say, if those 30%, you can probably do even higher. If they're mostly in the form of medium chain triglycerides, such as coming from coconut oil, those get almost immediately oxidized, similarly to sugar. They don't require the so-called L-carnitine shuttle to basically shuttle them into the mitochondria. They can diffuse freely through the cell, and they get, because they're of medium chain length, they get oxidized very similarly to sugar with about the same speed. So when we talk about high fat, we mean eating more than 30% fat of fats with chain length of, let's say, 12 or longer. So we're talking about myristic, which is 14 carbon chain length. Then you have pentadecanoic. Then you have the palmitic acid, and then you have like heptadecanoic. Then you have stearic acid, and so on and so on. So those are the fats that actually tend to get stored because they get metabolized much more slowly.
Are those PUFAs or saturated?
No, they're saturated fats. Now, so if you're eating more than 30% fat, more than 30% fat is calories. if they're of the medium chain length, then you probably will not be gaining weight, as you will not be activating the Randle cycle to that level. Now, if you're eating the longer chain fats at 30% or more of calories, you may be gaining some weight, but it's still much more preferable because they will change the composition of your fatty acid tissue. And then because the fatty cells express these enzymes COX and LOX, the less PUFA they have at their disposal, the less inflammatory mediators they'll synthesize. So you can be actually, it's been shown that you can be morbidly obese, but if the composition of your fats is mostly saturated, you can be in almost perfect cardiovascular health. Sumo wrestlers are actually in pretty good cardiovascular health, and they fatten up by eating mostly beef fat and rice and lean protein. So they actually eat a tremendous amount of food, but most of their fat is subcutaneous and it's saturated. So despite their truly morbid obesity, I mean, like some of these people have basically they weigh like 400 or 500 pounds or even more. These people are relatively healthy and much healthier on average than a person who is mildly overweight, let's say a BMI of 30 to 31, or at least very early in the obesity scale on a Western diet, which unfortunately it includes mostly PUFA. It didn't used to be like that. If you look at some of the curves that are showing the changes in weight gain over the last century, and it compares that to how the composition of the fatty acids is changing to the diet, the increase in weight gain tracks almost perfectly the replacement of the animal fats with the vegetable fats. So you can thrive on a high-fat diet if it is preferably the medium-chain triglycerides, or second best, almost fully saturated, such as from butter, beef tallow, sheep loin, things like that. But if you're consuming 30% diet and most of that 30% fat diet, and most of that fat is PUFA, you're already in a pro-inflammatory state, and then dumping extra sugar on top of that, at the very least, will probably not make things better, and that it may temporarily even increase some of the inflammatory mediators, which is what may be seeing in those studies. So, but low fat, like I don't mean go to like 5% or lower. That truly is fat restriction. But optimal responses have been shown for maintaining weight, which may be different for reproductive health, from reproductive health. Let's say a young woman like you, if the goal is to maintain lean state with a lot of muscle, about 10 to 15% fat has been shown to be optimal. However, that has been shown to not be optimal for child rearing purposes. Slightly higher fat percentage in the diet and as a BMI has been shown to drastically improve fertility and ability to retain the fetus and give the birth to a healthy baby than women who are actually skinny. So this actually now has been starting to be recognized by many obstetricians and gynecologists. So when women go for their, when they get pregnant and they go for their, every month or so,
yeah,
they always measure weight. And I think if you're dropping below BMI of 25, the doctors are actually starting to get worried. They're saying, don't worry about it, don't go crazy, but that extra weight is actually very much necessary for maintaining a healthy fetus. And it's very well known that if you're below BMI of 25, many women actually have trouble conceiving, especially if it's below 23, then it's really a problem. In fact, I think most women with a BMI of 23 or lower, they probably struggle with amenorrhea, just like you said, or some other, reproductive problem, including polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is, the myth is that it's always, this is always seen in women that are overweight. Not true. Actually, about 30% of the women with polycystic ovarian syndrome are very, very skinny. And another thing that invalidates the mainstream theory is that, because you're eating too much, you're getting fat, and like that's what's causing it. No, you can get it, just like hypothyroidism, you can be very fat or very skinny, depending on which organ it affects more. So I guess the goals will be different. If you're a younger person and don't intend to become pregnant anytime soon, I'm speaking to females, right? Then, and you want to maintain that physique, 10 to 50% fat is probably optimal for that purpose. Now, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to feel your best, right? There are other things, like the brain needs a lot of fat, it needs cholesterol, right? So if you feel best at a higher fat percentage, I don't think there's any problem with eating it, as long as you make sure that try to get most of it from the medium chain triglycerides. And if not, then at least try to eat the saturated fat, because it's not going to cause long-term damage. And in fact, by changing the ratio, by increasing the ratio of saturated fat to PUFA in your fat tissue, it's going to create a lower long-term inflammatory burden compared to somebody who mazzolas themselves every day.
Yeah. I would say like I'm definitely at that like a little bit higher fat, not like 35, like not like the 40-50%.
Right.
But and then I prioritize, I have my coconut oil with my Ray Peat carrot salad, and then I prioritize butter, tallow, and egg yolks. And that's like pretty much the only fats. I consume a lot of those, but I try to prioritize the higher saturated fat, animal fat sources. And I personally have just found that I feel better when I don't venture close to that 10 to 15 low fat percentage.
Right.
But like you said, everyone has different goals. And I just think that if someone's main focus is to be lean, you just have to ask yourself why. There's plenty of data showing that may not be optimal health. And yeah.
Okay. This paradox recently confirmed even in patients with COVID-19. They used to say about a year ago, they said that obesity is a risk for COVID-19 death. Now they found the exact opposite. Actually, morbidly obese people almost never die. they sit in the ICU, maybe even in a coma for weeks, but eventually recover. While the skinny people, if they end up in the ICU, things are not looking good for them, about 40% mortality rate. So I guess, I mean, it's different things for different people. Also, people with cancer, the ones that are overweight have a much lower mortality. Now, some studies are saying, well, if you're obese, you may have a lower mortality risk, but you have a higher risk of getting the cancer to start with. Science is now reversing course on that too. Turns out that it really depends on the composition of your fatty tissues. If they're mostly PUFA, they produce the inflammatory mediators all the time. Those inflammatory mediators and the unmetabolized PUFAs themselves activate the enzyme aromatase, so you tend to overproduce estrogen, right? But in people like the sumo wrestlers whose fat is mostly saturated, they actually don't produce as much estrogen, and many of them, live pretty healthy and active lives. They're wrestling, for Christ's sake, into their 50s and 60s. While still weighing relatively non-healthy 500 plus pounds that would make any Western doctor puke.
So I think that's a great summary there. Your composition of the fat inside of you is important, and that is directly dictated by the foods that you're consuming. So rather than trying to find an optimal macro split, instead focus on choosing better food choices, because that's going to have a direct implication on what your body is building itself with. So I think that's people should focus more on that rather than like, I want to be this percent body fat, so I have to eat this percent fat, consume this many calories and things like that. Focus on building habits and forming your food choices first.
Absolutely.
Okay, we've been talking for a long time. Do you want to do one more and then we'll have to get you back on for a follow-up?
Okay. All right.
Okay. All right. So this is a big one. I do not know how to properly respond to this in that sugar and advanced glycation end products, so AGEs.
Right.
Isn't there a huge connection with eating sugar and then forming these AGEs? So when fat and protein combine with sugar. So how would you respond to that criticism of the bioenergetic?
So almost all the studies that have looked at the advanced glycation advanced glycation end products demonstrate that lipid peroxidation is a requirement for this process to occur, which means, once again, sugar may be a contributing factor, and that's a big maybe, but it's not the required factor. The required factor is lipid peroxidation. And what fats peroxidize? The unsaturated ones. Most, actually, the polyunsaturated fats the most, right? It's been shown that advanced glycation end products actually are almost impossible to occur in species that have a high saturation fat index, such as the naked mole rat, which, by the way, is almost immune to cancer. So if you look at it, it's a very disgustingly looking creature, but it's extremely resilient, lives for like 30 to 40 years in hives. So it's almost like a bee colony. They have a queen, and then they have all of these rats that are specializing like in different functions in the nest, right? But also it retains very high levels of carbon dioxide into its hive that's under the ground, and also its fatty acid composition into the fatty tissue is almost completely saturated. And those animals, unlike their regular rodent brethren that are used in the laboratory studies, they have almost no advanced glycation end products. So there's only two explanations really. Either the high carbon dioxide is protecting them, or the saturation of the fat of their tissues. However, there have been naked mole rats taken out of the hives and taken to laboratories to try to breed them for studies. And of course, then they start getting fed these commercial diets, which they kind of have no choice but eating. And in those rats, then they start seeing a robust increase in the advanced glycation end products. And to me, that proves that it's not the sugar, because the regular rat chows that are sold commercially to feed laboratory animals, they're not high in carbs. They're basically about 30 to 40% carbohydrates, which is what doctors recommend for most people to eat. They're about 30% fat, right? And I think about 30 to 40% protein. So the only explanation to me is that something in the diet changed and caused the increase in these advanced glycation end products. And the one thing that happened when the diet of the naked mole rat changed was the amount of PUFA drastically increased and carbs actually decreased compared to the diet that they were eating in the wild when they're living in their nest. And as you mentioned, that study at Peat sites, studies have shown that the formation of one of those glycation end products, which is carboxymethyl lysine, it happens 20 up to actually, I think this is one study, but I saw another one up to 50 times faster and more easily in the presence of extra polyunsaturated fats and or administration of drugs that increased oxidative stress. In other words, drugs that interfered with the flow of electrons from food to oxygen, right? So PUFAs create oxidative stress, and also they're the source of lipid peroxidation themselves. But it's important to note that other agents can cause it too. In other words, if you do anything to interfere with metabolism, such as stress. So stress could be a big cause of advanced glycation end products, because it inhibits the flow of those electrons. And if those electrons have nowhere to go, cannot pair up with oxygen, they basically start leaking through the membrane, the mitochondrial membrane, and start attacking the lipids into the cell, into the outer cell membrane. And then depending on your diet, if those lipids there are mostly PUFAs, you're going to get both peroxidation byproducts and the advanced glycation end products. So yes, sugar does have a role there, but without the PUFA, the formation of advanced glycation end products is negligible. Again, PUFA and stress together make the advanced glycation end products the menace that they are. And even though sugar has a participatory role, it's not facilitatory role. And in the absence of one or more of these factors, stress or PUFA, you're basically getting a negligible amount of AGEs to the point where they're probably not going to cause any health problem.
Yeah. Okay. So just to point out, so this study documented that lipid peroxidation of PUFAs produces the protein damage from AGEs 23 times faster than the simple sugars do. And so I think that that's a pretty interesting argument that a lot isn't presented. Like, I've never seen this study before until I saw Ray Peat's article on it. So I thought that was.
And also, to point out that since you said it, since they happen so much faster and much more easily as a result of the lipid peroxidation, which means that most of the AGEs you're seeing in the body will be the result of lipid peroxidation, right? So if only 1/24 of the AGEs are due to sugar, roughly speaking, right? This means about 5% of the AGEs, or what is it? 1/25 is what? Yeah. So 4% of the AGEs in your body are due to sugar, right? So largely not much to worry about, and you have this other 96% to worry about, which are due to the lipid peroxidation reaction.
Okay. Well, I think that we again return to the point that this combination of carbohydrates and PUFAs is just not ideal at all. And that's what the standard American diet is. That's what a lot of these studies are using, which is unfortunate. And potentially it's the PUFAs, and then sugar sources or carb sources are just adding fuel to that fire based on the inflammation that was started by the PUFA. And so that's kind of the whole premise of this bioenergetic approach. Let's remove the actual trouble child of the PUFA and optimize from there.
Yeah, and we already have studies just like the Coke study with the rats showing that if you remove the fat, which was mostly PUFA in the normal rat chow, because they're trying to make it as cheap as possible, right? So the normal Purina rat chow, Purina actually makes the makes food for rats as well. It's about 60% polyunsaturated fat. So it's very closely mimics the fatty acid composition of your standard Western diet. More,
60%?
yeah, 60% or more, or more. I mean, you're producing these multi-metric tonnages a year to feed all these rats around the world. You're not going to be going and slaughtering cows and like collecting butter to make it yummy.
Right.
You won't have long shelf life. You want low quality, like low price. They don't care what they feed their rats. To them, food is food. The same analogy as the car. And which brings another point, which may be a good closing, is that many of the animal studies, the only thing they show is how suboptimal the diets of both the lab animals and the humans really is. That's really what it comes down to. Because if you look at many times in the animal studies, they compare like the so-called lab rat with the wild type rat, right? And the without exception, the wild type animals are invariably healthier. They live longer. They produce bigger and healthier litters. They're much smarter. They perform better on cognitive tests. They have much higher resilience to stress and lower rates of depression when you stress them out chronically. They tend to dislike addictive substances, which the Purina fed rats absolutely love. I think it's because it lowers their dopamine and they craving that dopamine hit, right? They're doing like it's very easy to get a lab rat addicted to morphine, to alcohol, to cocaine, to pick up your drug of choice that gives you this buzz. Lab rats are all over. The wild type rats, they prefer excitement and interesting lives and good food and healthy mates to this like abnormal lifestyle that we have, cornered ourselves into with our Western societies. But there is a way out. I mean, the knowledge is out there. It's about experimenting and trying to find out what works best for you.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so we're gonna have to get you back on because I've got like quite a few more like Ray Peat criticisms that I'd like to present to you. So looking forward to that future discussion. But I really appreciate your time. And how can people find you?
I have a blog, where I post like a few like my comments on a recent study. It's usually like 2 to 3 paragraphs of intro, what I think about the study, and then I relate it to other studies that I've seen in the past. And my blog is haidut.me, haidut.me. And I also like everything I post on the blog also gets automatically sent over to Twitter as an excerpt. So maybe the easier way to follow me is by following me on Twitter. It's twitter.com/haidut, same alias. And I also post on the Ray Peat forum. But over there, I try to engage more in discussions than really post new studies. So if you want to engage in a discussion with me, the Ray Peat forum, again, Haidut is my alias there, is a good way to contact me for back and forth. And if you want to follow like the things that I do on a more scientific basis, because now I'm starting to conduct my own studies as well, then the blog and the Twitter would be better.
And then you have a supplement company as well?
Yes, it's called Idea Labs, and the website is Idea Labs DC, all one word. So it's like labs for ideas, Idea, LABS, and then DC because we're in Washington, DC, all one word, idealabsdc.com. And basically products that most of them are vitamin based. Some of them are steroids, such as over-the-counter steroids like pregnenolone, progesterone, DHEA, and every product that we have is kind of like falling into the footsteps of this bioenergetic idea. And I have a lot of studies for each product that kind of back up their usage. Of course, not 100% truth. Nobody has access to the full truth, but I'm pretty sure I have more evidence than for many of the drugs that are prescriptions that are in circulation right now.
Okay, great. That's one thing that I really appreciate about your work. You are testing out these bioenergetic ideas in real life, and that's really cool. So
yeah, and I can send you some of the studies that I've started to conduct myself with a research group in Bulgaria. We already have 8 or 9 publications, and I'm gonna try to like test some of those Ray Peat ideas, some of the ones that are most controversial, such as what happens if we fully replace PUFA into the body? Do the animals become immortal, or are they truly resilient to diseases, immune to cancer? things like that. Or like what happens if you drastically increase the carbohydrate intake from various sources of carbs. Develop a truly low fat, high carb diet, but also try to distinguish between the different carb types, like high starch versus high sugar, table sugar versus high honey, or versus high fruit diet, which is probably optimal because it's got the fiber, mostly fructose, not much glucose, a lot of micronutrients that are kind of missing
Yeah.
sugar. So little by little, God willing, I hope I'll be able to test all of these by myself. So once I see the results myself, I'll have a lot more confidence to speak about it, because the rest of it is discussing other people's studies. As they say, until you dip your finger into the truth, you don't even know 1% of it.
It's a great point. All right. Well, thank you, Georgi, for all of your work and your time today. Really appreciate it. And we'll have to get you back on again soon.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.